They said I was a burden. They said it softly, with those careful smiles people use when they want to sound kind while rearranging your place in the room. I remember the exact moment the word landed, light as dust but heavy enough to tilt my whole world. A burden, not a mother, not a woman who once held a family together through years of work and sacrifice, but a burden. A thing that must be managed, softened, excused. It wasn't even my son who said it first. It was his wife, Carla, her voice wrapped in the silk of good manners. "We love having you here," she told me, "but it's a lot to manage, the schedules, the space, the energy." Then she laughed, as if to make the word lighter, as if laughter could change its weight. Daniel stood behind her, silent, holding his coffee cup with both hands. I looked at him, hoping for a sign of disagreement, but his eyes were fixed somewhere beyond me, as if the air between us had become easier to look at than my face. I am 76. I have lived alone for almost 10 years since my husband Frank passed. My house in Oregon is small, a weathered blue cottage with ivy creeping along the porch rails, and a fig tree that still bears fruit every other summer. When Daniel invited me to stay for a few months in his new home in Connecticut, he said it was so we could spend time together. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. You want to think your children still see you as part of their lives, not a guest who must be fitted between their commitments. I packed carefully, folding my best clothes, baking a tin of raspberry scones the way he liked them as a boy, tucking a photograph of Frank inside the pocket of my coat. The flight was long but manageable. The taxi ride from the airport was quiet. When I arrived, the house was beautiful, modern, polished, the kind of place that photographs well. Everything inside seemed to gleam with effort and intention. Everything except the space I occupied. The first sign came quickly, almost too quiet to notice. Daniel whispered, "Don't tell the neighbors you're my mother." His tone was casual, as if he were asking me to pass the salt. I remember the way the words felt, like stepping into cold water before you're ready. He said it while opening the front gate, eyes darting toward a man watering his lawn across the street. I nodded because I didn't know what else to do. I smiled at the neighbor, pretending not to notice the distance that sentence had just created between us. I told myself it was nothing, that Daniel must have his reasons, that perhaps he was protecting my privacy, though deep down I knew it wasn't that. Inside, Carla welcomed me with the kind of politeness that leaves no trace of warmth. The house smelled of lemon polish and faint perfume. Everything was color-coordinated: cream, ash, muted gold. It looked like a magazine spread. She took my coat, commented on the flight, then guided me to the guest room at the far end of the hall. It was spotless and cold, with a single framed print of a landscape that could have been anywhere. There was a folded card on the nightstand with the Wi-Fi password printed beneath the words, "Welcome, guest." I sat on the bed, my suitcase still zipped, and realized I was not being welcomed home. I was being accommodated. At dinner that night, I tried to start small conversations, asked about their plans, their new neighbors, the baby. They answered politely, but always in the plural. "We're very busy. We're adjusting. We've got so much going on." The child, my granddaughter, slept upstairs. They didn't offer to bring her down, said she was fussy after naps. I smiled and nodded. After all, a guest doesn't make demands. I told myself I would make it easy for them. I would help with the cooking, keep my things tidy, offer to babysit. I would show gratitude. Gratitude had always been my armor. When you've spent decades smoothing the sharp edges of other people's lives, you forget that gratitude can become a kind of silence. And silence, when it grows too long, starts to sound a lot like erasure. The next morning, the house woke before I did. I could hear movement downstairs, the rhythm of young people rushing toward their day. When I came into the kitchen, Carla was already blending something green in a glass pitcher while Daniel scrolled through his phone. They looked up briefly, smiled, then returned to their motions. "We're heading out soon," she said over the noise of the blender. I nodded, poured myself coffee, and asked if I might take a walk later. Daniel hesitated. "Sure, but maybe don't go too far. It's a very particular neighborhood." He meant polished, careful, the kind that looks suspiciously at anyone who doesn't belong. I almost laughed. I had paid for half this house, and yet I was the one who didn't belong. After they left, I wandered through the rooms. The walls were decorated with architectural photographs, city skylines, bridges, modern art, but no family pictures, not one. I opened a few drawers in the hallway, found a folder with mortgage papers, and saw my name printed neatly on the first page. My hand didn't tremble. I just traced the letters slowly, the way you touch something you thought had vanished. I remembered the day Daniel asked for help, the soft panic in his voice, the way he promised it was only temporary, that he just needed a co-signer. I had sold bonds Frank left me, money I thought I'd use for travel or a new roof. I didn't hesitate. You never think that the person you raised might one day treat your generosity like a footnote. That afternoon, I stood by the window and watched a group of children ride their bikes down the street. Their laughter floated up through the air like something from a different life. I wondered if anyone passing by would know who I was, if they'd guess that the woman in the window had once built everything around her from the ground up, a home, a marriage, a son, only to become invisible in the very space she helped create. They called me a burden. Maybe they didn't mean it as cruelty. Maybe it was fatigue or fear, or that modern fear of anything that reminds people of aging, of time catching up. But I am not a burden. I have carried heavier things than silence, heavier than shame. I carried them and I survived. So as I sat there in that immaculate house where my name was half remembered, where my photograph didn't hang, and where my presence was politely minimized, I began to feel something unfamiliar. Not sadness, not even anger, but a clarity that felt almost electric. I realized that if they could rewrite who I was, I could rewrite what I still had the power to do. And somewhere deep inside me, the first small, steady thought began to form. This house is mine, too. And so is the choice of what happens next. The morning it happened was too quiet, the kind of quiet that sounds deliberate, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I came downstairs expecting to find Daniel reading the news and Carla arranging breakfast, but there was only the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint scent of coffee someone had poured, but not finished. A note sat on the counter, written in Carla's tidy, looping script. "We're out running errands. Don't worry about lunch. Back soon." I remember standing there for a moment, the note trembling slightly in my hand from the current of the air conditioner. The house felt both new and used, like a hotel room at checkout time. I made another cup of coffee, but it tasted thin, as if even the water had forgotten me. When they returned, the sun had already shifted across the windows, leaving the room shadowed in neat diagonal light. Carla called out a distracted hello and disappeared into the office. Daniel walked past me with a brief smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Busy morning," he said, setting down a stack of envelopes. I asked if everything was all right. Fine, he replied, his voice tight, his focus somewhere beyond the conversation. He opened one envelope, frowned, and then without looking up added, "Mom, I meant to tell you. The neighborhood association is hosting a dinner next week. It's mostly members, a networking thing. It might be best if you sit that one out. It's not really family-oriented. I asked lightly. Do you mean it's not mother-oriented? He chuckled awkwardly, the sound small and quick. You know how people are about appearances. Appearances. The word hung there, dry and final. I nodded, the way a guest nods when the host adjusts the rules of the house. It was not the first time he had used that word since my arrival, but it was the first time it settled like a verdict. I thought about all the years I had spent keeping appearances for him, attending parent nights after double shifts, sewing the seams of his shirts so he would look respectable, writing checks to cover tuition when his father's business failed. I had carried his appearances long before he could afford to curate them. Later that evening, while they prepared for guests, a couple from the neighborhood whose names I kept forgetting, I offered to help set the table. Carla smiled, thin as paper. Everything's handled, she said, handing me a folded linen napkin as if it were a peace offering. I placed it carefully beside my plate anyway, just to have something to do. The couple arrived, polished and charming, full of talk about investments and schools. When introductions came, Carla said, "This is Mary Ann, an old family friend visiting from Oregon." The words slipped out easily, practiced. For a second, I waited for Daniel to correct her, to add even a small word, mother, mom, anything, but he didn't. He poured wine, laughed at a joke, and moved on. It was a simple omission, almost graceful in its execution, but I felt it like a physical touch, a hand pressing me gently out of the frame. I smiled and played along. It was easier that way. Yet inside, something irreversible shifted. The air between us changed shape. I began to understand that this house, this new life they were performing, had no room for the woman who built the foundation of it. After dinner, when everyone had gone and the dishes were stacked in perfect rows beside the sink, Daniel thanked me for being so understanding. I wanted to ask what I was supposed to be understanding, but the question would have been wasted. I simply nodded. When I went to bed, I didn't sleep. I lay still and watched the faint pattern of the ceiling in the half-dark. There is a moment in every kind of leaving where you are still physically present, but emotionally gone. I think that night was mine. The next day I took a slow walk through the neighborhood. The sidewalks were lined with trees too young to provide real shade, but they tried. The houses looked almost identical, bright, immaculate, each with its own variation of perfection. I wondered which of the neighbors had seen me arrive, a woman carrying a modest suitcase and a tin of pastries, and what they had assumed I was. Perhaps a visiting aunt, perhaps a housekeeper. In one yard, a small girl waved at me, then glanced toward her mother for approval before waving again. I waved back and smiled. The child's mother did not return the gesture. It was nothing dramatic, just another small silence. When I returned, Carla was in the kitchen arranging flowers. She asked if I had enjoyed my walk. I said I had. Then she looked at me, the vase in her hands, and said, "I hope you're comfortable here. We want you to feel settled." The pause before settled was deliberate. It was a word that meant both safe and temporary. I told her I was fine. She smiled, satisfied. That afternoon, I opened the closet where my suitcase stood half unpacked. I took out the envelope containing the deed, the same one I had photographed the day before, and laid it flat on the bed. My name, printed neatly in black ink, seemed almost foreign now, as if it belonged to someone braver. I traced it with my finger. Ownership, I thought, is not only about property, it's about presence, about the right to exist without apology. When Daniel came home that evening, he was distracted again, tapping messages into his phone. He mentioned they might take a short trip soon, just a weekend getaway to recharge. Carla nodded eagerly. They spoke as if I weren't there, planning around me, assuming I would remain still and waiting. Something in me tightened, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I realized I was not living in their home. I was occupying a vacancy they hadn't yet listed. That night, while they slept, I sat at the small desk by the window and made a list. It wasn't dramatic, just practical. Bank account numbers, the name of a lawyer I had once met through a friend, the real estate office 2 blocks away. The list was a quiet act of remembering that I still existed. Outside, the streetlights threw pale gold onto the lawn, perfect and unbending. I watched their glow and thought of my own mother, who used to say that dignity is not something you demand. It's something you quietly reclaim. The catalyst wasn't loud. It didn't arrive in a storm of words or slammed doors. It came in the shape of polite silence, in the realization that a life can shrink if you let others decide your measure. It came with the knowledge that ownership isn't just a line on a deed. It's the right to step back into the light of your own story. And by the time the first morning birds began to stir, I already knew what I would do. I folded the list, slipped it into my purse beside the deed, and whispered to the quiet house, "Thank you for showing me what I had forgotten." Then I turned off the lamp and waited for dawn, calm, certain, ready to begin again. I woke before the sun and lay very still, listening to the house breathe in its careful way, the vents sighing, the refrigerator humming, the distant whisper of the baby's sound machine pulsing like a tiny tide beyond a closed door. And I told myself that if I moved slowly enough, I could slip through the morning without jostling anything, as if courtesy were a kind of invisibility cloak that would let me pass. And yet by the time I reached the kitchen, the day had already arranged itself without. Me, 2 travel mugs lined up like soldiers, a neat stack of printed schedules on the counter, color blocks for school pickups and classes and workouts, my name appearing only once in timid italics beside the word guest, and beneath it a small type suggestion, walk if weather allows, which struck me as both considerate and surgical, like a note a nurse might tape to the end of a bed. Daniel came in fastening his watch, kissed the air near my cheek, and said he'd be late because of a client dinner, and Carla, already immaculate, slid a small ceramic dish toward me with 2 vitamins and a glass of water, as if I were a plant to be, watered on a set cadence. She spoke of balance and routine and how the thermostat worked best if kept at a constant 68, then apologized for the clutter as she wiped an invisible streak from an already shining counter, and I thought of the messes that once meant a life was being lived: crumbs after breakfast, wet socks by a heater, a half-finished puzzle on a table. And I realized that in this house, evidence of life was the enemy of its design. I took their suggestion and walked, not far, just the long rectangle of the neighborhood, a loop of nearly identical facades where every mailbox looked like it had been chosen by the same committee, and the lawns were clipped so closely they might have been shaved, and a woman I had waved to the day before paused by her hydrangeas and asked if I was enjoying my stay, her voice bright, the way people speak to toddlers and tourists. And when I told her it was a beautiful area, she nodded and said, "We do try to keep things a certain way." And the "we" settled me further into my assigned category, a visiting variable that should not alter the equation. Back in the kitchen, a new note waited, this one in Carla's precise hand, reminding me not to run the dishwasher unless it was full and to use the guest mug to avoid confusion. And there it was, on the second shelf, a white cup with a cheerful gold rim and the word "welcome" printed in a font that wanted very much to be friendly. The rest of the cups were heavy and stone-colored and lived together on the lower shelf, and I took the guest mug with exaggerated care, as if it might bruise if I gripped it too tightly, then filled it with coffee and carried it to the table where my seat had begun to appear by default, a corner with a view of the side yard and the neighbor's fence, which needed painting in a way that was almost a relief, because it acknowledged impermanence. In the afternoon, Carla returned with grocery bags and a distant smile. She placed a paper sack before me and said she'd picked up a few things more appropriate, and inside I found a cardigan the color of oatmeal and a pair of soft-soled shoes, described as supportive on their tag, and she said the sidewalks here were unforgiving, and she worried I might trip, and I thanked her because I was raised to thank people who told me what I needed, and I remembered buying Daniel's first winter boots, with soles so rugged he could have climbed a mountain with them if mountains had existed in our part of the world, and how he wore them in July with shorts, because he loved the way they made him feel capable. And it occurred to me that this is how life is edited, not with a red pen, but with neutral colors and quiet safety, and the suggestion that risk is a childish thing. That evening they posted photos from a dinner out, a row of portraits lit with soft restaurant light, captions about community and gratitude, and I recognized the shirt I had ironed for Daniel that morning and the earrings Carla had borrowed from a velvet tray, and I scrolled through the smiling faces and noticed my absence had the consistency of policy rather than accident. The word family appeared, as it often does, as a kind of spell, and I set down my phone and made tea and watched the steam rise like something alive escaping. Day by day, the house taught me its preferences. The living room lamp should be lit only in the evening to preserve the bulbs. The runner in the hallway ought not be walked on with damp feet. The guest towels were the gray ones with a faint herringbone. The bath mat was not to be moved because it left impressions. The blender could not be used after 8 because the baby's window was sensitive. And when I asked if I might cook dinner, one night, trout and lemon, a simple thing, Carla smiled and said, not to fuss, that they were off fish this week. And she set a boxed salad on the table with toppings in separate compartments so no herb would surprise anyone. I began to keep my little routines in the spaces between their larger ones, wiping the crumbs they did not see, watering the basil plant that sulked on the sill, folding a throw blanket that never let itself relax, and in the evening, after they had retreated to the primary suite, I would sit at the far end of the sofa and listen to a classical station on the lowest volume and think of all the living rooms I had known, threadbare ones and loud ones, and rooms so full of voices you had to carve your words into the air, and how every one of them had forgiven me for existing in it, while this one merely tolerated me like a polite stranger on a bus seat no one really wanted to share. One afternoon, the Homeowners Association newsletter arrived, a glossy booklet that called itself a bulletin, and Daniel left it on the counter with a sticky note asking Carla to pay the dues online. The cover featured a photograph of a cul-de-sac, sunset, and an article on quiet hours etiquette, as if quiet could be legislated like trash pickup. And as I paged through it, I found a column about property stewardship that suggested trimming hedges to a uniform height and limiting porch decor to 2 tasteful elements. And the phrase tasteful elements rang in my chest because I recognized it as the new catechism of belonging, a religion of surfaces. And I wondered what a life would look like if it were pruned to the same obedience. That evening, Daniel asked, almost offhand, if I could avoid mentioning the particulars of the house to anyone, and when I tilted my head, he clarified that people here could be sensitive about equity, and he meant money, and he meant narrative, and he meant the satisfaction of believing one's world was entirely self-made. And I thought of the way we used to mark Daniel's height on a door frame, pencil lines climbing a chipped white board, each hash a proof of becoming, and how the house we lived in then had a sagging porch and a furnace that coughed, and neighbors who borrowed sugar without apology. And I felt not nostalgia, but the memory of oxygen. I tried to be useful in ways that wouldn't disturb the choreography. I offered to pick up dry cleaning and learn the preferred starch level. I tidied the pantry and discovered a strict taxonomy of snacks by child and time of day and fiber content. I stitched a loose button on Daniel's cuff only to find that the new shirts came with spares in tiny plastic bags, replacements that rendered my hands unnecessary. And in a quiet hour, I took out the deed again and smoothed it with the back of my nails, not because I needed to confirm anything, but because paper has a kind of temperature that living things remember. And the page was cool, and the ink was definite, and my name was an anchor that refused to dissolve. Sometimes I would sit on the back step with the guest mug and watch the light move across the yard, and the sandbox still lay unopened under its plastic, and the young maple staked to a post wavered with the smallest breeze like a promise unsure of itself, and I would imagine the yard the way it could be, if allowed to be slightly unruly, with a patch of herbs and a messy cluster of zinnias and the trace of bare feet, and the imagining felt almost like disloyalty, which told me how far I had drifted from the center of my own will. They recalibrated around me in small ways that added up like rain. A spare key was moved from the bowl by the door to a drawer in the office. Not to exclude me, they said, but to standardize. And the garage keypad code changed to one that matched a birthday I did not know. And the baby monitor app password was updated because the pediatrician recommended limiting access for security, which may have been prudent, but also had the consequence of turning me into a visitor who required chaperoning to gaze at a sleeping child. And on Tuesday, a delivery arrived. In a box big enough to be a statement, a new set of dishes labeled shatterproof for everyday use, and the old plates, heavy, faintly chipped, still good, were wrapped with murmured apologies. Will donate, and I stood there holding one of them, feeling the familiar weight settle into my palm. And then I placed it into the paper like I had been asked to put away a story. On Wednesday, the doorbell rang while Carla was out, and I opened it to find a neighbor I had seen only from a distance, a woman with sensible shoes and the kind of face that does not condescend. She introduced herself as Ingrid and held out a loaf of bread with the old-fashioned pride of a gift made by hands, and when I thanked her, she leaned in and said in a voice meant to be kind, "We wondered when we might meet Daniel's mother." And the word mother flashed so brightly, I almost had to close my eyes, and I said, "Yes, I am she." And she nodded, as if confirming something she'd suspected. And she glanced past me toward the immaculate hallway and said, "Beautiful place, but a house is not just a shine." And then she excused herself, and I watched her cross the lawn, and I understood that even in a neighborhood dedicated to managed appearances, there are glints of reality that slip the net. I left the loaf on the counter with a note for Carla from Ingrid across the way, and later found it sliced into perfect even pieces and sealed in a container labeled freezer, and that, too, felt like a metaphor that didn't need to be explained. By the end of the week, the pattern had acquired a rhythm so smooth it could almost be mistaken for harmony. I woke, I performed the slender duties assigned to an absence. I walked the perimeter. I returned to rooms that preferred to forget I had been there. And at night, when the house dimmed itself and arranged its shadows with care, I began to practice a new habit. I would sit upright on the guest bed and speak my name aloud, just once, not as a demand, but as a locating device, the way a lighthouse pushes a pulse into fog. And in that quiet articulation, something in me stopped shrinking. I did not slam doors. I did not break the choreography. I did not accuse. I made lists, and I listened, and I learned the grain of my resolve. First escalation, people like to say, as if change is a staircase. In my case, it was a very slow pivot, the way a plant turns toward a kinder window, and each small refusal to disappear, wearing my navy dress instead of the oatmeal cardigan, leaving the guest mug clean but choosing a heavy stone cup for my evening tea, telling Ingrid my name without flinching, was a degree on the compass, too slight to notice until the horizon itself had shifted. And so when Daniel mentioned, with careful brightness, that he and Carla might sign up for a wine club that offered members-only events, "You'd probably find it dull, Mom. Lots of standing." I smiled and said nothing, because I had already adjusted my coordinates, and when Carla asked whether I'd be comfortable using rideshare if I needed to go into town because parking by the cafe was tight, I nodded as if that detail were important, and afterward I went to the small desk and opened the drawer, where I kept a folded page of names and numbers, and I added one more line, Ingrid, bread. And as I capped my pen, I felt the steadiness that comes before a weather change, not wind, not thunder, just a pressure shift in the air that birds recognize long before people do, and I understood that the first escalation had done its necessary work. It had taught me, gently and thoroughly, how a person can be edited out of her own generosity, and in this taut, curated quiet, I was already doing the opposite, restoring myself word by word, list by list, and preparing, without spectacle, for the moment when courtesy would give way to choice. The first shift did not announce itself with anger or revelation, but with something smaller, a steady clarity that grew between breaths. It began one gray morning when the rain had not yet decided whether to fall or simply hang there, suspended like a thought. I was sitting in the kitchen, the guest mug in front of me, the air humming with the fragrance of citrus polish, and I realized that I had stopped tasting the coffee weeks ago. It wasn't bitterness I noticed, but absence, the dull neutrality of something that once had warmth. I looked at the mug, at the bright gold letters spelling welcome, and for the first time, I saw them as an instruction meant for someone else. The moment was small, almost laughable, yet I felt a current move through me, a recognition that waiting politely inside other people's definitions of kindness had become its own kind of slow erasure. I rinsed the mug, dried it, and placed it back on the shelf in perfect alignment with its twin. Then I opened the cupboard below and reached for one of the heavy stone cups, the ones reserved for family. I filled it deliberately and sat down again. The world did not collapse. The ceiling did not shudder. The coffee tasted alive, as if some boundary had shifted back toward me. That small defiance set in motion a series of adjustments so quiet they could be mistaken for the normal breathing of the house. I started walking further, past the confines of the neat neighborhood, into the older streets, where paint peeled from fences and porches leaned comfortably into time. There, people nodded instead of evaluating. One afternoon, I found a cafe tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat, a place that smelled of yeast and honest exhaustion. I ordered tea and sat near the window. The woman behind the counter had silver in her hair and a pen tucked behind her ear. She moved with the brisk grace of someone who had no patience for pretense. When she brought my cup, she said, "You're new." I told her I was staying nearby for a while. "Then welcome," she replied, not like a slogan, but like a door left open. I stayed longer than I meant to, reading the paper, listening to the hum of small conversations. Nobody looked at me as though I were an obligation to be managed. They simply let me exist, and that simple permission felt almost radical. When I returned that evening, the house glowed in its usual curated light. Carla was arranging candles for dinner, Daniel pacing with his phone. They asked politely where I had been, and I said, "out," a word that once would have needed justification. Now it was sufficient. After the meal, I sat in the living room with a notebook I had bought at the cafe, a plain blue book with thick paper, and I began writing lists again. But these were not lists of tasks or possessions. They were lists of memories, the color of Frank's first car, the sound of rain on the roof of our old house, the smell of Daniel's hair after his first swim meet. I wrote them without commentary, just lines of evidence that I had lived. The act steadied me. It was not nostalgia. It was reclamation, a way to remind myself that my life contained more than the present room could hold. The next morning, while Carla took the baby to a class and Daniel was at work, I gathered the courage to visit the small real estate office I had noticed weeks before. Its windows were dusty, its blinds uneven. Inside, a woman about my age looked up from a computer and smiled with that unfiltered warmth that comes from surviving many seasons. Her name was Lillian. When I told her my situation, she didn't flinch or tilt her head in pity. She simply asked questions, dates, signatures, percentages of ownership. I handed her the folded deed, and she examined it carefully. "You have every right to make decisions here," she said. "You're listed as co-owner." The words fell into the room like stones finding the bottom of a pond, clear and solid. I thanked her, and she offered her card. I slipped it into my purse with a strange sense of calm. Nothing had been decided, yet something had undeniably begun. Walking back, I felt the rain finally commit to falling. The street shimmered. The air smelled of earth, and for the first time in months, I let it touch my face without rushing for shelter. By the time I reached the gate, I was soaked and smiling. Inside, Carla looked up from her laptop, startled. "You should have called for a ride," she said, half scolding. I told her I liked the rain. She frowned, unsure whether that was an argument or a confession, and returned to her screen. I went upstairs, changed into dry clothes, and stood at the window watching the water collect in the gutter like a thin silver ribbon. It struck me that for years I had treated discomfort as failure, as something to be corrected, when in fact, a little discomfort was often the first sign of change. Over the following days, I visited Lillian twice more, officially at first, then under the pretext of friendship. We spoke of paperwork, yes, but also of gardens and travel and the unpredictable generosity of strangers. Each conversation widened the horizon a little further. She never pushed, simply reminded me that ownership, like dignity, can only be surrendered by consent. Her words stayed with me, circling quietly in the back of my mind. I did not yet know what I would do, but I knew I would no longer leave that decision to anyone else. At home, the routines continued with their usual precision, but something subtle had reversed. When Daniel reminded me about household rules or Carla corrected how I folded the towels, I listened with genuine detachment, as if they were lines in a play I had already seen, their anxieties no longer attached to me. I cooked simple meals for myself, left my door slightly open at night, played music at a volume audible enough to prove existence, but too soft to be labeled disruptive. Once, while Carla was out, I opened the baby's window so fresh air could mix with the sterile hum of the purifier. The curtains fluttered, and sunlight landed on the crib like a blessing. When she returned and noticed, she closed the window without comment, but the air lingered, faintly alive, refusing to settle back into its former stillness. The midpoint of any life, I think, is not marked by age, but by recognition, the moment you stop confusing endurance with virtue. Mine came quietly on an ordinary Thursday. I was folding laundry in the guest room when I heard Daniel laughing downstairs, the easy laugh he used with colleagues. I realized I hadn't heard that sound directed toward me in years, maybe decades. And instead of sadness, I felt a kind of release. I understood then that my longing for inclusion had been a habit, not a need. People can live entire lifetimes mistaking acceptance for love and obedience for peace. I set the folded towel on the bed, sat down beside it, and felt the solid presence of my own body, my own choice. The quiet that followed was not empty, it was mine. That evening, as the sun dropped low, I took my navy coat from the closet, the one I had kept folded since arriving, and hung it by the door. Carla noticed and asked if I planned to go out. I said not tonight, but soon. She hesitated, then nodded. After she went upstairs, I slipped my hand into the pocket and found the old photograph of Frank, its edges worn smooth from being touched. I looked at his smiling face and thought how proud he would have been, not because I was planning something dramatic, but because I was remembering the muscle of decision, the quiet courage of a person who still owns her next step. From that night forward, I began each morning differently. I brewed coffee in the heavy cup, wrote one true sentence in my notebook, and opened the window regardless of weather. The rain came and went, but the air felt honest. I no longer cared whether they approved of my rituals. They were not rebellion, but renewal. And though nothing in the house appeared to have changed, I sensed that the balance of gravity had shifted ever so slightly, enough that I could feel myself turning toward the light of my own making. That, I suppose, was the real midpoint, the moment the story stopped being about survival and quietly became about freedom. The weather turned at the edges first, a thin coolness in the mornings that made the kitchen tiles feel more like stone, a faint amber to the late light that drifted across the dining table, where no one quite breathed without checking the time. And I felt the season shifting, the way you feel a conversation change direction just before the sentence lands in a place you didn't intend to go. And perhaps that is why the envelope on the mat looked so ordinary when I found it, why I opened it with the unhurried confidence of someone expecting coupons or a church newsletter, only to unfold a letter written in a familiar, looping hand that traveled straight through my ribs and into the years when a small boy believed the world would be kind because I told him so. It was from Kieran, my grandson, the only one of that generation whose visits were not negotiated by calendar and mood, and his words were steady and unadorned. "Grandma, where are you? Are you well? I miss you." And at the bottom, a number, with a little arrow pointing at it as if to say, "Use this if you can bear it, but if not, I will try again in a better way." I sat down at the end of the hall on the bench, where nobody sits because it is decorative, the kind of furniture that proves restraint, and I read his letter twice, then a third time, letting the quiet sincerity of it warm me in places I had allowed to go cold for safety. And I realized with a start that while I had been busy reclaiming ownership of my days, another kind of claim had been quietly reaching for me, a thread of loyalty that did not demand, only asked. I did not call him at once, I placed the letter in my notebook between 2 pages where I had written small truths about myself, the kind you don't say out loud, because speaking them too soon can let the air take them. And I carried that notebook too, the cafe on the corner with the chipped saucers and the brass bell that rings even when no one touches it. And I ordered tea, and I let myself imagine the sound of Kieran's voice without deciding anything beyond the next sip. When I came back, Daniel was home earlier than usual, pacing as if trying to wear a path into the kitchen tiles he liked so polished, and he looked up with that careful brightness that means news has to be managed, then told me he had been asked to give a short talk at a neighborhood event that weekend about community resilience. And I felt the irony curdle, but I didn't show it. Instead, I asked what he planned to say, and he answered with phrases that sounded like polished stones: support, systems, intergenerational strength, shared values. And I nodded, storing the words the way you store stormwater, not because you will use it, but because someday someone will need to know where it went. The next day, a second envelope arrived, this one with a logo in the corner and the heavy humidity of paper that expects obedience. It was from a local law office with a name that sounded like mahogany, informing me in sentences that took the long way around any feeling that my son and his wife were concerned about my well-being, and suggested a meeting to clarify intentions regarding the property so that the family could plan responsibly. And the words family and responsibly sat side by side like actors shaking hands in a curtain call, polite and victorious. I placed the letter on the table, turned it so the logo faced down as if that might reduce its volume, and I made myself a sandwich I could taste, the kind with mustard that reminds your mouth what certainty is. When Daniel came in later, he approached the paper with the same caution one reserves for a sleeping animal, and he said that he hoped I understood why they had reached out, that sometimes it was easier to put things into writing so everyone felt secure. And I answered that I agreed entirely about writing, that writing can be a mercy because it keeps people from claiming they said the opposite. And he adjusted his cuff and changed the subject to a podcast about longevity. And I felt something inside me stand up and take a step toward the door it had been eyeing. Kieran's letter softened me in one direction, while the law office hardened me in another. And between those two motions, I found a kind of equilibrium I hadn't known to ask for. I called Lillian at the real estate office and told her about the incoming pressure, and she was quiet for a breath and then said, with the calm of a person who has seen more maps than storms, that ownership is not a feeling, it is a record, and records do not speak in the language of worry. She gave me the name of a lawyer she trusted, a woman with a small office above a tailor's shop who answered her own phone, and when I sat across from her, she listened without arranging my story into the version that would be easiest to file. She asked for copies of everything, looked me in the eyes as often as she looked at the deed, and finally said, in a voice without decoration, that I was not a trespasser in my own life, and that if any meeting were to be had, it would occur on my terms, at my time, and with her present to remember out loud should anyone develop selective amnesia. The house felt my changed weather the way animals feel the pressure fall before rain. Carla began speaking in a tone that assumed agreement, the smooth cadence of committees, explaining that a photographer might come by to update a listing for a community magazine, and they would love to show 3 generations under one roof, an image that would require me, apparently, to be both invisible and essential in the same frame, and I said that my schedule was full, and she blinked because I have never had the audacity of a schedule in this house. Daniel, for his part, grew tender in the way people do when they need something signed. He appeared in doorways with small offerings. Do you want the good tea? Shall I move the chair? Would you like to pick the film? And each question was a hand, extended with strings dangling, and I smiled, not unkindly, and said I had things to attend to, which was true even when those things were as simple as sitting still long enough to feel my pulse under my thumb, proof that the person in this room had not expired under the weight of other people's arrangements. 2 days before the neighborhood event, I finally called Kieran. He answered on the first ring as if he had been sitting with the phone in his hand. And when he said Grandma, the word did not crack. It opened, and I stepped into it without apology. We spoke about small things at first. The bookstore where he worked nights, the stray cat that had adopted the loading dock, the way autumn light finds the exact color of old paper and drags it across the floor at closing time. And then he said that his father was worried and angry at the same time, a combination he wore like an expensive coat, and that there was talk of sorting out the title situation before the holidays. And I told him in the same gentle tone I used when he was 6 and trying to hide a broken vase in plain sight that there was nothing to sort, only something to be remembered. And he was quiet then in a way that felt respectful. And when we hung up, he did not ask for my address. He only said, "Whatever you choose it as if I'm watching and learning," which is the most honest thing any young person can say to the person who taught them how to tie their shoes and their sentences. On Saturday, the house filled with voices, coats slid onto the right hangers, and the careful laughter of people who have rehearsed the shape of it gathered under the high ceiling. I poured water, traded pleasantries, and stood where the wall met the room, a habit formed over years of making space for other people's comfort. A woman with a name like a scented candle asked Daniel how he managed to juggle all the generations, and he answered with a smiling humility that would have photographed very well, and I felt a sudden surge of mischievous clarity that had less to do with anger than with oxygen. So when she turned to me and asked if I was enjoying my extended stay, I answered that I was learning a great deal about stewardship, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a house is to make sure it doesn't forget who turned the key first. And her eyebrows rose like 2 small boats, and she changed the subject to the community garden, where the tomatoes were underperforming, which seemed both accurate and symbolic. Carla's smile tightened the way ribbon does when pulled too hard, and Daniel took to refreshing his glass, and the evening wound down without confrontation, because I no longer needed a scene to justify a decision. I only needed a good pen and a steady hand. The next morning I wrote 2 letters. The first went to the law office with the mahogany name, a clear page that stated my status, my representation, and my availability for a meeting on a weekday of my choosing at a location not in my kitchen. I signed it with the same careful strokes I used to sign permission slips, aware that the power of a signature is not its flourish, but its refusal to tremble. The second went to Kieran, a softer letter that told him I was taking steps to make the future simpler, not out of spite, but out of respect for the work I had already done, and that when the dust settled, he could visit me in a place where our time would not be measured by someone else's calendar. I walked both envelopes to the mailbox in my navy coat, and the morning wind lifted the hem the way a good decision lifts your posture. Pressure, when it fails to achieve submission, changes tactics. 2 articles appeared online the following week from a community blog that functions as both bulletin and rumor mill. one praising Daniel's commitment to multi-generational harmony with a photograph of him ladling soup at a fundraiser, the other a gentle meditation on supporting aging relatives that read like it had been edited by someone who clips coupons for empathy. Friends of friends sent links with heart emojis. I declined to perform gratitude. Instead, I met with the lawyer above the tailor and answered her practical questions with practical answers. We reviewed scenarios and timelines. She reminded me that sentiment belongs to private rooms, while property lives in public records, and that confusing the two is how people end up homeless in houses they purchased with their own lives. It was around then that Ingrid, the neighbor with the sensible shoes and the bread that tasted of afternoons, knocked on the door with a spare key in her palm. She said she had found it near the mailbox and thought I might want to return it to whichever drawer such things now lived in. And I took it with a thank you that meant more than courtesy, and she stood there a moment longer than most neighbors allow themselves and said, in a tone that declined complicity, that her mother had lived with her the last 2 years of her life, and that it had been both difficult and correct, and that the only part she regretted was how often she had allowed other people's need for tidiness to make her curt with the woman who taught her what tenderness was. And I put the key on the entry table between a small sculpture that means nothing and a bowl that means order, and I told her I would try to remember this. When the performance of concern began to drown out its content, and she nodded, and in that doorway we constructed the smallest, strongest kind of alliance, one that expects nothing except honesty when the door closes. The phone rang more often after that, and I discovered that you can tell the difference between a call and a summons by the way your stomach behaves when you see the name. Daniel's name felt like an appointment, but Kieran's felt like an invitation, so I answered the latter more than the former, and in those conversations a new map assembled itself, bookstore anecdotes, a poem he'd copied for me, a description of the way steam rises from the street after a sudden shower, and each call made it easier to bear the messages that arrived in careful tones about timelines and optimal outcomes, as if love were a project plan. I did not argue on the phone because I had learned that argument only strengthens the scaffolding it climbs. I told Daniel that any matters regarding the house would be handled by my counsel, and then I asked about the baby's new tooth, and the abrupt change of subject made him huff like a runner forced to slow on a hill, and I ended the call before he could return to the point, because ending calls is a right, not a sin. The last press of the season arrived in person. Carla stood in the doorway of the guest room one afternoon, her face composed the way good crystal is clear, and she said she hoped there were no hard feelings, and that the family needed stability, and that uncertainty was hard on the children, and that decisions about property could be frightening when one was, she paused here, searching for the least offensive word, older, and I answered that uncertainty is hard on everyone, and that fear is not the same thing as prudence, and that age is not a synonym for confusion. And then, perhaps because I was tired of being a polite mirror for other people's reflections, I added that I trusted her to weather a transition she had benefited from, and that if she needed a list of moving companies with gentle reputations, I could provide one. And her lips paled the way paper does when rubbed too long, and she whispered that I didn't have to do this, and I said that I did not have to do anything, which is exactly why I would do this one thing. After she left, the house went quiet in a new register, not the curated silence of control, but the dense calm of a field before harvest, and I sat at the small desk and wrote 3 words at the top of a blank page, show up fully, and then beneath them, I wrote the actions that would make those words true. the calls and the signatures and the meeting on Wednesday at 2 in an office that smells of wool and steam because of the tailor below. And as I finished the list, I felt the strange, almost giddy relief that comes when a long-held pose is finally released and blood returns to the sleeping limb. Pins and needles of awakening, yes, but also the knowledge that the limb is still yours. That night, I lay in the guest bed and listened to the house practice its careful breathing. And I thought of the first day I arrived with my tin of scones and the photograph in my coat. And I wished, briefly and without bitterness, that someone had stood in the doorway then and said to me plainly what I now knew, that love is not proven by how quietly you diminish yourself to fit into someone else's arrangements, and that the door between endurance and consent swings on a hinge you can oil with your own name. In the morning, I rose before the sun and brewed coffee in the heavy cup and opened the window to let in air that had not yet learned the day's temperature. And I dressed in the navy coat that makes my shoulders remember their original architecture, and I walked out with a folder under my arm that contained the past in black and white and the future in blank lines. And I turned the key in the lock with a hand that did not shake. And I stepped into the crisp air of a morning that had decided to be clear. The day of the meeting began without drama, as most irreversible days do. I woke before the alarm I had not set, sat on the edge of the bed, and listened to the faint rhythm of water running through pipes as the house prepared itself for another round of ordinary time. In the mirror, the woman looking back at me was alert in a way that required no makeup. Her face was the same one she had worn for decades, but the arrangement of calm behind the eyes was different. I brewed coffee in the heavy cup and drank it slowly, letting the warmth move through me like a signal of readiness. Down the hall, the baby stirred, a brief cry that sounded more like a reminder that life continues than a plea for attention. I stood by the window, watching the slow arrival of daylight. The sky had that clean, diluted color that comes only before a decision finds its form. By 9 o'clock, I was in the lawyer's office above the tailor shop. The air smelled faintly of wool and lemon polish, the hum of the city below filtering through the thin glass. My lawyer, Margaret, arranged the papers with deliberate precision, not to impress, but to keep the narrative in order. Across the table sat Daniel and Carla, their posture correct, their expressions composed in the brittle style of people performing civility under duress. Between us lay a folder containing the record of ownership, signatures written years apart, but on the same line of authority. The conversation began in the practiced tone of professionals navigating discomfort. Margaret explained clearly and without temperature that as co-owner, I retained full rights to sell, lease, or inhabit the property, and that the decision to liquidate was within those rights. Daniel's jaw flexed, his voice level but thin as paper, when he asked why I would want to cause such upheaval. I answered that the upheaval had already happened. It had just been quiet enough that no one heard it but me. Carla murmured something about family, about optics, about neighbors. I told her that houses care little for optics. They care for maintenance and truth. The papers were signed not in anger, but in the clarity of sequence. Pen uncapped, ink flowing, names repeating themselves in different columns like echoes formalized. Each stroke of my signature felt less like aggression and more like restoration, a movement that returned weight to the hand that had been trained for decades to stay still. When the final page was signed, Daniel leaned back, his mouth open to form a sentence that he never found. I reached into my bag, took out the photograph of Frank that had traveled with me through all the phases of this story, and placed it beside the folder. I said, quietly, that he had taught me to finish what I start. Then I stood, thanked Margaret for her clarity, and turned toward the door. The entire meeting had lasted 47 minutes, but it contained the length of a life's correction. Outside, the air had turned crisp, a brightness sharp enough to slice through habit. I walked without hurry down the block, the sound of traffic folding itself into a rhythm that felt almost like applause. I stopped at the cafe with the chip saucers and ordered a cup of tea. The woman behind the counter, who had begun to recognize me, smiled and said, "Big day?" I told her, "Just an honest one," and she nodded as if that were answer enough. I sat by the window, the steam rising between me and the street, and allowed myself to feel the odd, expanding quiet of completion. It wasn't triumph. Triumph is noisy. This was something slower. A widening of space around the heart, where fear had lived, rent-free for too long. By afternoon, the calls began. First Daniel, then Carla. I let them pass to voicemail. Their words, when I finally listened, were a mixture of disbelief and appeal, the tones of people discovering that control had never been love. I deleted the messages after hearing them once, not from cruelty, but from mercy. Neither of us needed a record of panic. Instead, I called Kieran. His voice carried that steady warmth I remembered from childhood summers, when he would chase fireflies across the lawn and call out to show me their captured light. I told him that everything was in motion now, that there would be noise for a while, but it would settle. He asked where I would go. I said I hadn't decided yet, but somewhere with a garden, somewhere that did not require permission to open a window. He laughed softly and said he would visit, and in that laughter I heard the continuation of everything worth keeping. The sale itself moved faster than anyone predicted. The market was restless, and buyers appeared as if summoned by momentum. Each inspection, each signature, each notarized page felt like an exhale I had been holding since the day Daniel whispered at the gate. The house that had once mirrored my silence now mirrored my action. Its surfaces gleamed for strangers who saw only design, not history, and I found that oddly fitting. When the final transfer was complete, I walked through the empty rooms alone. The echo of my steps surprised me. I touched the wall near the kitchen, where the morning light used to fall, and instead of sorrow, I felt recognition. The house had never been mine to inhabit forever. It had been mine to free. I locked the door for the last time and placed the keys in an envelope for Margaret to deliver. Ownership, I realized, is not possession. It is the ability to decide when to let go. The days that followed were quiet in a new way. I moved into a small apartment overlooking a park where the trees leaned toward each other like confidants. The space was simple. 2 rooms, a balcony, a kitchen with enough counter for real cooking. I unpacked the essentials, a few books, Frank's photograph, the navy coat, the heavy cup, and arranged them without sentimentality. When Kieran visited for the first time, he brought a plant and a loaf of bread. We ate with our hands, crumbs scattering like punctuation, and he told me that his father had been silent for weeks, walking through the spaces of his own making as though he no longer recognized their scale. I said only that silence is the sound of rearrangement. He didn't press for more. Instead, we talked about his classes, his friends, the stray cat that still refused to be named. When he left, he hugged me longer than necessary, and in that embrace, I felt not rescue but continuity. Sometimes, in the early evening, I walk to the park and watch people who are still learning the art of ordinary joy. Children running, couples arguing softly, old men feeding pigeons that no longer need feeding. I think about the word burden and how lightly it is spoken, how often it hides the speaker's own fear of dependence. I think about houses and the way they collect echoes, and about how freedom often arrives disguised as paperwork. Mostly, I think about choice, the quiet, unglamorous power of choosing the shape of your own day. That, I have learned, is what dignity sounds like. The absence of apology in the presence of decision. One evening, as dusk settled, I received a short message from Daniel. It was not an apology, not yet, just a sentence that read, "I hope you're well." I stared at it for a while, not deciding whether to reply. Then I wrote, "I am." It was both true and sufficient. When I set the phone down, the room seemed to expand slightly, as if space itself had been waiting for me to acknowledge it. The plant Kieran had brought was blooming small white flowers, despite my inconsistent watering. The city outside hummed with its usual indifference, and I felt myself part of it, not as ornament, not as burden, but as a woman who had re-entered the world under her own name. Later that night, before sleep, I stood on the balcony. The air smelled faintly of rain. Somewhere below, a street musician was playing a slow, uncertain tune on a violin. It wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but it was honest, each note searching for the next, with the kind of courage that doesn't need audience approval. I thought of the house one last time, not as a loss, but as a completed sentence, and of all the unspoken words that had led me here. Then I went inside, turned off the lights, and lay down in a bed that held only my own weight. For the first time in years, the darkness felt like rest, not erasure. The mornings now arrived gently, without the negotiations of duty that used to wait behind every dawn. I wake when the light finds me, not when a schedule dictates, and the first sound I hear is the creak of the old window frame as it adjusts to the air. The apartment has settled around me, in the way a coat learns the shape of its wearer. The walls still smell faintly of fresh paint, and the faint mineral scent of dust that comes with peace, not neglect. The kitchen window opens onto the park, and the trees, taller now, are beginning to lose their leaves in quiet spirals that remind me of paper falling through time. Sometimes I think of how the world can go on remaking itself even while people insist on staying the same, and that thought, rather than saddening me, feels like a small mercy. I have come to understand that permanence was never the reward. Continuity was. The first few weeks after the sale were filled with silence that had texture. I would make tea and sit at the little table by the window, watching light change across the park, and I could almost feel the noise of my old life thinning out behind me, like fog burning away at noon. Letters arrived, some from neighbors, some from people I hadn't heard from in decades, some unsigned. They all said variations of the same thing. They had heard. They couldn't believe. They admired my courage. They pitied my son. I answered none of them. I have learned that explanation is a form of apology, and I no longer apologize for existing according to my own gravity. If someone wants a story, they may tell it themselves. Mine belongs to me. I spend more time outdoors now. The park is full of small, ordinary dramas, dogs pulling at leashes, children learning balance, couples practicing patience, and I have become a silent witness to these rehearsals of living. I walk without hurry, carrying nothing but my keys and a small notebook. Sometimes I stop at the cafe for tea, and the woman behind the counter has started to call me by name, a small grace I didn't know I still wanted. We speak briefly, exchanging the shorthand of those who respect each other's solitude. She asks if I am writing something. I tell her I am just remembering in the right order. Memory, I've discovered, is an art that demands honesty more than detail. Kieran visits when he can. His energy fills the room the way laughter fills old houses, eager, unself-conscious, clean. He helps me rearrange the bookshelves, pretending to need my opinion while quietly ignoring it in favor of symmetry. We eat simple meals and talk about music, about the stubborn cat that finally let him scratch its head, about the world that will come after ours. Once he asked if I ever missed the house. I told him no, and I meant it. But later, as he washed the dishes, I thought about what I did miss. The sound of my own footsteps on wooden floors, the echo of movement through space that used to belong to me. Yet even that memory doesn't ache anymore. It's just a sound that has completed itself. When he leaves, he always hugs me twice, once for himself, and once, I suspect, for his father, who cannot yet cross the distance between guilt and love. I let him. In every generation, someone must practice forgiveness first. Daniel has written twice, short notes, no apologies, just check-ins. The first time I answered politely. The second time I didn't. I am not angry, I am finished. There is a difference. I have come to believe that some reconciliations are meant to happen in silence, years after words would have spoiled them. He will understand one day, or he won't. Either way, I wish him the courage to see his own reflection without flinching. That, too, is inheritance. In this smaller home, time has become more generous. I read again, slowly, without urgency. I cook meals that have no witness and yet taste complete. The air carries the fragrance of the neighbor's jasmine plant through the open window. And at night, I can hear the faint sound of music from the bar across the street. I have learned to sleep with the world's noise instead of against it. There is something profoundly healing in realizing that you are no longer performing your existence for approval. I move through my rooms as if they were written in my own hand. Some evenings, when the light tilts just right, I think of Frank, not as absence, but as fact. I speak to him sometimes, not expecting answers, just because speaking aloud reminds me that I still have a voice worth hearing. I tell him about Kieran, about the cafe, about the plant that keeps blooming no matter how erratic my care. I tell him that the story ended quietly, that no one shouted, that I did not burn bridges but simply stopped rebuilding them for others to cross. I think he would understand. He always believed that peace was not the opposite of struggle, but the skill to walk through it without losing your name. A few weeks ago, Ingrid came by, the neighbor who once brought bread to that old house. She said she had followed the news in her own discreet way and wanted to see where I had landed. We shared tea and laughter, and she looked around my modest apartment as if it were a revelation. "It suits you," she said. I smiled because it does. We talked about gardens, about aging as an act of quiet defiance, about how women of our generation were trained to carry everyone's comfort but their own. When she left, she squeezed my hand and said, "You did something many of us only dream of. You ended the story before someone else wrote your last line." That night, I slept without dreams. Now the days are smaller but fuller. I have started tending herbs on the balcony, parsley, mint, thyme, and they grow as if they, too, understand what it means to have enough space. The other morning, a bird built a nest between the railing and the flower pot, weaving bits of straw into an architecture both fragile and absolute. I watch it work and think that all creation begins the same way, with a refusal to disappear. Sometimes, in the afternoon, when the light moves across the room and touches the photograph of Frank, I imagine another woman somewhere, my age or older, sitting in a similar chair, wondering if it's too late to reclaim herself. I want to tell her it isn't. Dignity doesn't expire. It waits. So this is where the story rests, not with punishment or regret, but with understanding. The house was sold, the silence broken, the weight lifted. I did not win anything. I simply stopped losing myself. The world outside continues. Cars, markets, elections, storms. But inside this small orbit, the air is steady. Each morning I make coffee in the same heavy cup that once felt like an act of rebellion and now feels like belonging. I stand by the window, watch the trees shake free of whatever they no longer need, and I whisper a kind of blessing. May we all learn the courage to release what no longer shelters us. Then I drink the coffee slowly, letting it cool in my hands, tasting every note, and for the first time in a very long life, the warmth stays.